America and other free and open societies face crucial challenges and opportunities abroad that affect security and prosperity at home. This is a series of conversations with guests who bring deep understanding of today's battlegrounds and creative ideas about how to compete, overcome challenges, capitalize on opportunities, and secure a better future. I am H.R. McMaster. This is Battlegrounds.
On today's episode of Battlegrounds, our focus is on Afghanistan. Our guest is Ambassador Hamdullah Mohib. Mohib served as ambassador of Afghanistan to the United States from September 2015 until he was appointed the National Security Advisor of Afghanistan in August 2018. He advised President Ashraf Ghani until the Taliban takeover of Kabul on August 15, 2021. Ambassador Mohib previously served as Deputy Chief of Staff to President Ghani and holds a doctorate in engineering from Brunel University in the United Kingdom. Beginning in 2010, American officials tried unsuccessfully to negotiate ceasefires and a peace agreement between the Taliban and the Afghan government. In 2018, former U.S. Ambassador to Afghanistan, Zalmay Khalilzad, led U.S. negotiations with the Taliban without the Afghan government, with the purpose of withdrawing all U.S. forces from Afghanistan. The resulting 2020 accord pledged U.S. troops exit in May 2021 for the Taliban's renunciation of al-Qaeda, reduced violence, and discussions with Kabul. The secretive agreement undercut the Afghan government, America's partners for 20 years, and elevated the confidence of the Taliban and their terrorist and Pakistani sponsors, who saw the signed accord as a U.S. surrender. President Biden delayed withdrawal slightly until September 2021, but adhered to the exit plan despite an intensified Taliban offensive, a massive assassination campaign, and mass murder attacks against civilians. In August of 2021, the Taliban took over large swaths of territory in Afghanistan and ultimately toppled Kabul. Ambassador Mohib fled with President Ghani on August 15th. U.S. forces exited the country at the end of the month, after a chaotic evacuation effort. Approximately 120,000 U.S. citizens, visa holders, and Afghans who were in grave danger were airlifted out of Kabul. But hundreds of U.S. citizens and residents, as well as thousands of Afghans who worked with U.S. forces and coalition partners, who wanted to build a better future for their country after the hell of Taliban rule from 1996 to 2001, were left behind. Many have been brutalized or murdered. We welcome Ambassador Mohib today to discuss the cause of the collapse in Afghanistan, what is still at stake in Afghanistan, and implications for the United States and its allies and partners.
Ambassador Mohib, welcome to Battlegrounds. It's good to see you again, and thank you for joining us at what I know is a very difficult time for you and your family and your friends to help us understand how Afghanistan collapsed in August and especially why we're in the situation we're in today. So welcome, so good to see you.
Sure, McMaster, thank you for having me and for giving this opportunity to be able to talk a little more deeply about the issues that led to the collapse than what the media allows. I will try to see what we can cover in an hour. There is a lot to talk about, but we'll try to do as much as we can. And I think you are as important to this conversation as I am, because I want to. I think it's important that we have the U.S. angle covered here, as well as what led to the Afghanistan government's own weaknesses.
Well, I agree, and I think there's so much misunderstanding out there, Hamdullah. Yeah, and I'm sure since you've left, it's added some additional pain to you to hear some of the political narratives about the collapse. And as you reflect on what you hear in the U.S. media, what do you think? What's your assessment, and what do you think that the American people fundamentally misunderstand based on how the collapse of Afghanistan was covered?
Well, first of all, there is a lot of anger, understandably so, both among the Afghans and the Americans, particularly the veterans who served in Afghanistan. And I know a lot of these organizations and people that I've worked with when I was the ambassador here in Washington, and our own ANDSF forces, plus all those who put their stakes on the success of the republic, are all understandably very angry. And the disinformation from which the Taliban and our adversaries have benefited have led to even more confusion. And there hasn't been a clear discussion or multiple discussions that should have made it clear on what happened. And maybe it wasn't time for that yet. But of course, political messaging around the collapse, and those who had the opportunity to provide those political messaging took advantage of it, and tried to point it to one direction and create a blame game rather than trying to understand. I think we owe it to all of those who sacrificed and believed in the idea of the republic and a free Afghanistan, that we have a nuanced conversation about what led to this fatal failure.
I'll tell you, I think that's very important. I think it's important to see the collapse in August in context. And in Battlegrounds, I write that, hey, it wasn't a 20-year war from America's perspective. It was a 1-year war fought 20 times over. And in the book, I describe what you experienced, which were a number of fundamentally flawed and inconsistent U.S. policies and strategies over time. And I wondered if, as you look back on the series of these strategies, what do you think the turning point was when it began to, when we began to lose the initiative in Afghanistan? And the war was lengthened and made much more costly than maybe it would have been otherwise.
So, HR, if you remember when you were the national security advisor, I served in Washington at the time, and you worked on something that I thought was the first strategy that kind of went beyond a silo of terrorism approach to looking at terrorism and just resolving it from that. It went beyond that. South Asia strategy looked at Afghanistan and what it needed, but it also looked at some of the adversaries outside of Afghanistan and perhaps partners in looking at the broader perspective in a regional context for the problem that Afghanistan had, and rightfully so. The line or the support for Taliban from Pakistan was never clearly defined. Everybody understood it, and there was discussions even in Congress over that support, but never had there been a policy that addressed it. And then there were also internal issues inside Afghanistan on what level and what kind of support the Afghan defense and security forces needed. So when I went and became the national security advisor, we really invested in making that policy a success, that strategy a success. We brought the right leadership in place at the Ministry of Interior and Defense, and at the NDS levels. We put support mechanisms to ensure that we are looking at the regional dynamics properly. And by 2019, I started off late 2018, but by 2019, the summer, we were already pushing back against the Taliban, taking back districts. We took Wurduj and Yamgan districts in Badakhshan, Dayak, in Khwaja Umari, in Ghazni. Even as far as Kunduz districts were being taken back. And so there was a push against the Taliban. And by the winter or fall of 2019, we had plans in place to push back against the Taliban in the north, and also from the east, where situation was already stabilized by defeating Daesh, which is ISIS-K in eastern Afghanistan, and those two were to merge on west and the south in the summer of 2020. But the initiative or the abandonment of the South Asia strategy at that time, without fully informing us, there wasn't a notification to say this strategy is being abandoned. But by practically going towards that negotiated settlement with the Taliban, meant that the operations and the air support that the ANDSF received was cut back. And so the offensive operations in 2019 automatically came to a halt. And so that stopping of that operation, then switching in 2020 from offensive to active defense, I think was the straw that broke the bone of the ANDSF morale. That combined with the fact that with the negotiations made the lines between who is an enemy and who is an adversary that we are negotiating, or political adversary here, blurred. So if you are a soldier, you have something clear. You understand whether you fight somebody or not to fight somebody. And that person or that group you're fighting is either an enemy or not. And so we had confusing messages coming along. One, there was no offensive operation. It was active defense. It didn't give them the instructions to fight. It didn't give them the instructions to not fight. So they were lame ducks waiting to be attacked. One. And then the group attacking them was not clearly defined as an enemy anymore. So it created a confusing environment for the ANDSF rank and file in which they operated.
It really doubled down on the fundamental flaws in the Obama administration strategy, and this is what we tried to correct when we came into to help President Trump decide what to do, which he ultimately did in August of 2017, approve a South Asia strategy. And just to recap for our audience, some of the fundamental changes were that we designate the Taliban as an enemy again, right? The Obama administration had said, okay, the Taliban is no longer an enemy, even as they were killing our soldiers, killing Afghan civilians and Afghan security forces. So what the South Asia strategy did is it put us back on the offensive, designated the Taliban as an enemy. Of course, we increased intelligence and air support for the Afghan security forces. But also, as you mentioned, the strategy prioritized governance reforms to harden and strengthen Afghanistan against the regenerative capacity of the Taliban, which is in Pakistan. And, of course, took a fundamentally different approach to Pakistan, confronting Pakistan for its role in perpetuating violence and continuing to build Taliban and jihadist terrorist capabilities that of course have sadly won out. But importantly, Hamdullah, it removed a timeline as well, right? And I think this had a psychological effect, as you're mentioning, right? War is a contest of wills, and I think what you're describing is a loss of the initiative militarily in 2019 when we started what I would have called capitulation negotiations with the Taliban, and it delivered really a bolstering of the will of the Taliban and a psychological blow, I think, to the Afghan government and security forces and the Afghan people. Could you describe that shift in 2019? And you mentioned that you weren't consulted about it, right? This is just something that occurred with the opening of these negotiations with the Taliban Political Commission.
Well, Achar, I think you pointed to something very important, where it all started. When the surge in 2009 happened, it was accompanied by a deadline to withdraw. And that made the Taliban to understand that they only have to continue this for a certain period of time, and there was hope for them that generated. But it also made the region ponder. So countries around Afghanistan started to think about beyond U.S. presence in Afghanistan, and some started increasing their contacts with the Taliban and maybe even support to them. And then that was then doubled down with the idea of direct negotiations with the Taliban without the Afghan government being included. We live in a very complex region, and in my own direct discussions with the countries around us, they were very skeptical about what the U.S. was trying to achieve with these direct negotiations with the Taliban. And so they started increasing their own contacts with the Taliban because they believed that it seems inevitable that the Taliban will return. Even if they are not fully in charge of Afghanistan, they will have a big stake. So it started a self-fulfilling prophecy in which more and more support went to the Taliban from regional countries, and the undermining of the Afghan government that was not party to the negotiations. The Taliban had already won that debate or that argument, because they, even outside and even without reducing any kind of violence and the continuous killing of Afghans through targeted attacks and through suicide attacks, in any regard for Afghan life, were giving the kind of status as if they were a government in waiting while they were in Doha, and they didn't have to lift a finger to do anything to be able to earn that status. And so it also sent a signal to Afghan politicians and the active society, including the business community, who started reaching out to the Taliban more actively. And with that outreach, the ANDSF were not blinded to what was happening. So rank and file at the community levels, at the district and provincial levels also saw that was happening. And so they also started betting on a situation in which the Taliban may return. And while we tried to do our best in trying to keep their morale high, try to give them as much clarity as we possibly could, but it was impossible in an environment that was full of confusion and full of disinformation.
Well, this is what's heartbreaking to me, is that if we were going to leave Afghanistan, why the heck didn't we just leave? Why did we actually take a series of decisions and take actions that actually weakened the Afghan government and security forces and strengthened the Taliban on the way out? And you've mentioned several of these already. One is really just entering into these negotiations in the first place without the Afghan government. Psychological blow number one. Another that you mentioned is stopping the active targeting of the Taliban, the offensive operations against the Taliban. That's psychological blow number two. And then this engagement with the Taliban Political Commission, which is really just a shop window for the brutal organization that's in charge now in Afghanistan. This lack of clarity, right, on who the enemy is, what the enemy is. It seems, Hamdullah, that we conjured up the enemy in Afghanistan we would prefer, right? A Taliban that would share power, right? A Taliban, that would not go back to the brutality of that ruled with it in 1996 to 2001. A Taliban that would respect women's rights. But all the time, as you mentioned, I'd like you to speak maybe a little bit more about this. There was a massive offensive campaign ongoing against the Afghan security forces and government, and mass murder attacks against maternity hospitals and girls' schools, and then of course a huge assassination campaign against individual Afghan leaders who were trying to secure their country and build a better future. So could you describe really the enemy as you saw it, in contrast to the enemy that we had portrayed, along with Mullah Baradar, who we actively got the Pakistanis to release so we could negotiate with him, and of course he's just a shop window, right, for Hibatullah Akhundzada, and I think it's worth pointing out as we describe the Taliban, that the person who's in charge of Afghanistan today, right, encouraged his 17-year-old son to commit mass murder by suicide. So these are the people we actually helped put into power in Afghanistan. So what was it like to confront the U.S. portrayal of the Taliban, and then to see that, and then have to confront the actual enemy? And how would you describe the Taliban to our audience?
Well, HR, I think once again, very important topic. If you remember, I came to Washington and complained. You were not in office at the time, but I tried to speak with your successor, John Bolton. I wasn't able to get that meeting, but I tried to get the message delivered to Washington. If those that didn't fully understand what was happening and how we were feeling about being sidelined from these negotiations and what it would do, and this was even after the president had already sent a letter to Secretary Pompeo and ask if this was a withdrawal, that negotiation should take place with the Afghan government, not with the Taliban. But we were assured that it was a peace negotiation. So the question was, if this is what we call peace negotiations, it is not going to result in peace. It is going to result in a Taliban takeover, and this providing legitimacy to the Taliban, giving them an advantage with prisoners release and the likes of it, legitimizing the Islamic State in the agreement are not the way to go about driving peace in Afghanistan.
Just for our audience, I just want to make sure our audience knows this is the peace agreement that was so-called peace agreement, which I think it was a surrender document masquerading as a peace agreement in February of 2020. And then you mentioned the prisoner release, which was the demand that the Taliban put on this agreement, which was to force the United States to force the Afghan government to release 5,000 terrorists and criminals.
Well, to continue, I was shunned after that because of that complaint. The nature of how it came out was not liked by the administration, understandably so. But it continued. It continued to be sold to us as a peace process, and the Afghan government, which didn't believe what was happening was going to result in the kind of inclusive peace that the Afghan people wanted. And it was undermining its own peace efforts, was then labeled as a government that is undermining peace efforts. And there was an entire effort by elements outside of of perhaps the administration, but people who believed that the Taliban should be included in the government, understandably so. Started whitewashing the Taliban. We wanted to make peace with the Taliban, but if we wanted to make peace, there had to be truth to it on who the Taliban are, why we're making peace with them, and the Afghan people needed to understand and buy that idea. Instead of it being a regime change that we even then anticipated was going to be the case. So this started, like you call, the capitulation of the Afghan government. The institutions that were there built with your support, and for many sacrifices, both by Afghans and our allies, chiefly the United States, were all being undermined. And if those institutions were able to conduct and continue its work, we would have a different Afghanistan today, and not the problems that we are currently facing. But HR, while I say that, I also want to recognize that we, as the Afghan government, we also had our own problems. We had problems of organized corruption that was so enshrined in the republic that it was capitulating on its own. There was, impunity for crimes. There were the whole system, the way the system was, it was so intertwined with some of these very corrupt institutions that led to some of the problems that we had. We had issues with ghost soldiers. We had issues with contractors that were both contractors, but at the same time political stakeholders, and some of the media that didn't have accountability mechanisms because they were supported by elements that were also big key players. That said, we also received mixed messages on inclusivity from our partners. So those who were perhaps Western allies were encouraged to be included in the government, but at the same time, we were being penalized for not doing enough on corruption. So there was a myriad of issues that included political, regional, tactical military issues, to our incapability of some of the institutions. So when I talk about some of the problems that were in our bilateral engagement, that doesn't free us from all the other issues that were already very prominent, and also contributed massively to the end result that is the collapse of the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan.
These are groups, obviously, who perpetuated state weakness, right? Because these were criminalized patronage networks. Correct. That were hollowing out state institutions that we were trying to build together, because they actually were stakeholders in state weakness, because it was the weakness of institutions that gave them impunity and the ability to essentially divert assistance and steal from the Afghan state. But I'll tell you, Hamdullah, I always thought that one of the reasons why these groups remain strong is that the political settlement in Afghanistan became reliant on unchecked criminality is one reason. And another is because we kept saying we're leaving. And many of these groups were motivated by building up. They wanted to build up a power base in advance of a post-U.S. Afghanistan. If the situation devolved back into civil war, right, from 92 to 96. And so it was our short-term approach to the long-term challenge of Afghanistan that actually, I think, lengthened the war, made it more difficult, and weakened the Afghan state. Of course, as you mentioned, though, Afghanistan would be reliant on the international community for the foreseeable future. But I think between 2017 and 2019, it was at a sustainable level, right, where we could have worked together, for the foreseeable future, and allowed Afghans to continue to take the brunt of the fight on a modern day frontier between barbarism and civilization. And so what more do you think could have been done in that period? One of the things that is kind of heartbreaking to me again is the emphasis on negotiating with the Taliban, and that being our main diplomatic effort, while in Afghanistan, we closed our consulates across the country in Herat, in Mazar, in Kandahar, in Jalalabad. And we could have, I think, played more of a role in bringing Afghan communities together, right? Between the various Pushtun communities and the Shor Nazar groups and so forth. Because it was the lack of cohesion within Afghanistan that also created opportunities for the Taliban. Could you talk more about the political fragmentation of Afghanistan in this period, and maybe even take us up to the point when you and President Ghani flew to Mazar a couple of months right before the collapse? What was it like internally, politically in Afghanistan?
Well, internally, the political dynamics were very fragmented. There were divisions on multiple levels, but the criminal economy and some of those reasons that you mentioned led to even more fragmentation. So in 2009, when the elections took place, that's when I think a lot of the problems started to begin. A clear fragmentation started to appear in the political class, and the way politics had to be conducted. As I stated, it was already clear, like you said, that the U.S. is going to withdraw because it clearly said it was going to withdraw. Political leaders in Afghanistan started thinking about a post-U.S. Afghanistan and what, how they would survive in that post-U.S. Afghanistan. This combined with the region also preparing for that kind of a country, and started actively supporting elements in the country that would then secure their own interests in a post-U.S. Afghanistan. A big part of my 3 years in office was how do we prevent that kind of a civil war where there is not one proxy supporting one group, which is what we had a problem with, but multiple proxies fighting each other and turning the country once again to rubble and not just destroying property, but once again uprooting millions and millions of Afghans from their country. That was, I think, a major national security threat that I thought was at the lead of at the top of our priority lists, and so the groups thinking about their survival being in supporting or creating a block for themselves that would be that would require or could attract support from outside, started to fragment the society or the polity even more. It wasn't the society that was so fragmented. It was the political structures that were fragmented, that were supported. Like I said, there were media entities that were supported by foreign elements without clear understanding of what their goals and objectives were. And the government could not question it because again, the inclusivity understood by our partners meant that only these some of these individuals being included means inclusivity, not societal inclusivity, not inclusivity at the level of civil society and other groups represented. So inclusivity meant elite inclusivity, and the elite had to think about their own survival post-US withdrawal. And so we had a very divided society. When I became the national security advisor, one of my first reports to President Ghani after my assessment in the first 4 weeks was that we're not militarily weak. The ANDSF is fighting and giving sacrifices, and that is a proof that that's not where we're going to lose. Where we're going to lose is at the political front. What we need to do is bring and create political unity in Afghanistan. And we tried. I personally put a lot of my effort into trying to bring opposition figures into government. That was one way of making that happen. Try to consult with political leaders outside of the government to try to include them. But then we had this political process that was also ongoing. The peace initiative, led by Ambassador Khalilzad, which gave people other kinds of hope. I must have come across myself at least 20 political figures who all believed that they're going to be the head of the interim government arrangement post peace negotiations. So we had a very divided society, and if you couple that with the financial interests of some of these individuals who also were contractors, military contractors to the Afghan Ministry of Defense and Interior, and their own interests meant it weakened that singular purpose that was for the defense of the country. You said it right. If you want to fight, it's a matter of resolve. And so that resolve was being broken at multiple levels.
And and instead of, there's a mantra these days. Of course, you hear, I think, out of the Biden administration in particular, we need more diplomacy, more diplomacy. But of course, that begs the question: for what purpose, right? And what we did is, I think, we weakened the Afghan government diplomatically, and actually advocated for this heinous organization, the Taliban, to have a role in a sort of a coalition government. Of course, this was based on the assumption that the Taliban would share power, which they never intended to do. Could you talk more about this kind of secret diplomatic effort by Zal Khalilzad, who I should mention was a longtime rival of President Ashraf Ghani? There's a personal dimension to this, I believe. But what we wound up doing this period of time is advocating for this sort of idea of a coalition government. And can you maybe talk about how Zal Khalilzad was working with people like former President Karzai and Chief Executive Officer Abdullah to undercut President Ghani in this and advance this idea, right, of a coalition government with the Taliban as like a 1/3 part of the government?
Well, HR, the idea for how to achieve peace, or the opinion in which President Ghani believed that peace would come to Afghanistan and that of Ambassador Khalilzad was very different. First of all, we were led to believe that there was a peace agreement, and I've read comments in the last 4 months since Ambassador Khalilzad has publicly spoken, and other officials have spoken off the record. It had made it clear what our suspicion was, which was that it's a withdrawal agreement. But what we couldn't understand at the time, and didn't were reassured that it wasn't a withdrawal agreement, but a peace agreement, was why it was being conducted in such a manner. If peace is to be brought to Afghanistan, we need, first of all, the most important category that needs to be included are the victims. Those people who lost their lives as a result of the Taliban brutality, the attacks. We cannot ignore those groups. We cannot ignore the ANDSF that have been fighting the Taliban. And what happens? It's even on a practical level.
I would say, Hamdullah, I would say, and the future victims of the Taliban, which we've seen play out, right, since the Taliban's taken over. I mean, if we're lamenting the humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan, but sadly, it's a crisis that we helped precipitate.
Absolutely. HR, without, we'll come back to the other point, but you addressed something that is very close to my heart, and I want to talk about it, is who are we protecting post-Taliban takeover? Those people who had contacts and worked with Americans or other allies were evacuated, sure. But who is actually being targeted are those people who were locally fighting the Taliban. So these are local police. For example, in eastern Afghanistan, local police were very prominent. They protected their districts from the Taliban. And so there were local grievances that the Taliban are now revenging and taking revenge on. In Kandahar, we had the same issue across the south. We have these issues in the Paktia area. We have it throughout Afghanistan, but some areas where there were local forces that were strong and had been institutionalized are the ones that are paying the price now. And nobody is evacuating them because they don't qualify for any kind of evacuation because they didn't work closely.
They're not going to get a special immigrant visa or a P1 or P2 visa in the US.
Because they don't have the contact. They didn't have the advisors that work with them. But they were critical to the mission. These people protected everybody else around it. When we talk about the collapse taking place in the secret agreements that were made with the Taliban that led to the collapse, part of it was the fact that some of these groups were no longer supported. For example, the local police project was cut down in 2020, and so it meant that many police had never received their salaries for many months. They couldn't have been integrated into the national police. They couldn't have been integrated into the national army because their structures were different. The age groups, the requirement for the national army differed. And so they couldn't have been integrated in, but they had to protect their communities. They had to fight to protect themselves, and eventually were forced to make deals. The other element that actually created the collapse was the agreement that the Taliban would not attack capitals, district centers, and provincial centers. But it didn't stop them from attacking all of the outliers that were protecting the center. And so they kept targeting those outliers, those outposts that prevented them from massing on the centers in 2020, while we had no offensive operations going on. The other agreement that we found out in the last weeks before the collapse was that there was an agreement not to take any deep strikes. So the Taliban structured their military strategy around that, meaning
they could marshal their forces, for example, in what became known as the Northern Strategy, right? So they're massing forces. And Hamdullah, I'd like you, please go on with this. I don't mean to interrupt you, but please also talk about the nature of the Taliban, right? There's this idea that the Taliban is this kind of popular rural movement, right, that sort of emerged naturally in Afghanistan, when in fact it is a transnational terrorist organization that was funded and trained by Pakistan's ISI and other terrorist organizations like the Haqqani Network, with the assistance of Al-Qaeda, and funded by massive donations, right, that came out of Gulf states, not state-sponsored, but Gulf donors, as well as the Russians and the Iranians. So could you talk more about the nature of this offensive, right, and the marshaling of it, as you are, but also could you also describe the nature of the Taliban as a military and political organization?
So I'll come to that. And first, what we discovered in the last weeks of the Republic was that the Taliban were splitting their attack groups into subgroups, and only sending a part of that group to launch an offensive against a base. And the norm would be the ANDSF would put a defense, send reinforcements, send air support, and once enough casualties or the Taliban's groups were weakened, that attack would be considered ended or thwarted, and the base where the attack would start to evacuate their injured and taking care of what they had lost and keep account of that. But what we discovered was that there were repeat attacks on the same base. Once an attack took place, reinforcement were sent, air support was sent, a repeat attack would happen. And talking to commanders, eventually we discovered that the Taliban were splitting their groups into subgroups because they had agreed to a certain distance in which they would no longer be under target. So no airstrikes would take place beyond that distance. And so they were exploiting this strategy, while the ANDSF were not aware. The ANDSF only found out this after we saw this trend that that the same base would have 4 different waves of attacks in one night, eventually leading to its collapse. So there were agreements at the military level in which the ANDSF had no presence. And if you are party to the conflict and you are subjected to responsibility, but don't know what agreements were being made with the Taliban in Doha, the cell that came out of as a result of the Doha agreement, in which U.S. forces and the Taliban coordinated.
Hamdullah, we have so much to talk about, and we're running out of time, sadly. So I wanted to ask you, please, could you take this opportunity to maybe set the record straight on the last several weeks in August of this past year, and in particular yours and President Ghani's departure from Afghanistan, what precipitated that, and then I'd like to talk more about prospects for the future as well. But just your thoughts on and your personal experience in those last couple of weeks in Kabul.
Well, you're right. There is a lot to talk about, and you mentioned earlier about the groups that were working together and the Taliban and the nature of the way they're looked at. We had discovered in our own intelligence reports that were that an attack taken place in Kabul that was claimed by Daesh, ISIS-K, had its roots in the same networks that supported or were linked to Haqqani network, for example, and were funded by Lashkar-e-Taiba. So transnational groups supporting an attack that was then eventually claimed by ISIS-K. So we had this discussion with partners around that. We have to stop looking at these groups in silos. This is a platform, a base, a foundation from which they attract their support and they work together. And so maybe their political structures are different, but the purpose of what they wish to achieve is all the same. But it's a long topic, and I'm sure I hope that we'll have an opportunity at some point in the future to talk about that in more detail. As to the last weeks of the Republic, we really tried, first of all, to put up a strong resistance, to be able to create, as we were told, a stalemate that would push the Taliban to negotiate in earnest. But the reasons why we had to create a new stalemate when we had one earlier on is something that is for a longer discussion. But to prevent the progress of the Taliban and try to hold them, so that we could create an environment in which true negotiations would take place and an inclusive Afghan government could be formed. I personally was engaged in the last week on trying to create an environment in which that would happen, in which there would be impunity for ANDSF, and there would be immunity for those the groups there the pro-government supported groups, for civil society, for journalists, for women groups, for political leaders, so that a true agreement would come to play. But once this collapse began, it had demoralized at such a deep level that was no longer possible. And it was clear in my own discussions with military leaders that they were not able to resist because, as we had discussed earlier, the enemy was now blurred, and so the Afghan security forces, who fought bravely and defended the Republic bravely when they knew their purpose was now undermined, and they were told that this fight was no longer viable when they were hearing interviews from our international partners that the fight was not worth dying for. Purpose was not worth dying for. And so it weakened the Afghan security forces. And then what we were trying to achieve in the end was to see if there would be true negotiations that could take place with the Taliban. That wasn't the case. And in the end, departure by President Ghani was a fundamental objection to the nature of the negotiations, because the nature of this negotiation now came down to give the Taliban legitimacy by handing over power to them. And if President Ghani, and we did that, that would have disrespected all of the sacrifices the ANDSF made. The issue was no longer inclusive government. The issue now was the Taliban may include a couple or a few leaders from the republic, and that is it. Everything else would be an Islamic emirate, but just a couple of the people included. And that, to be able to do that, the Taliban could do that today, and it doesn't stop them from doing that. But President Ghani did not want to give legitimacy to the Taliban in this format, in this Islamic emirate that didn't include the values of the Afghan people, that didn't protect the Afghan people, those who aspired to have a democratic state. And so I think I fully understand the anger that is out there in certain communities and among Afghans, that it could have been handled. It could have been handled differently years ago. It could have been handled differently. We could have had a different outcome 3 years ago. We could have had a different outcome 2 years ago. Had there been clear, transparent discussion with the Afghan government in which we could have prepared for what scenarios were best achievable. But that didn't happen. And in the last weeks, it was no longer, or in the last 2 weeks, when the US was definitely withdrawing, the Taliban were not going to negotiate in earnest, and were not going to negotiate, and were in no mood for negotiation that would create a political environment that would protect the Afghan people. It was going to be a surrender agreement. And President Ghani didn't want to sign a surrender agreement to the Taliban and legitimize them in that way.
Well, just for the last question here, what I'd like to do is ask you to describe the situation in Afghanistan today. And then what is your reaction to those who say, hey, well, in the interest of humanitarian support of the Afghan people, we have to unfreeze assets and to the Taliban government. There are those who are actually advocating for recognizing the Taliban government, which I think would be a disaster for the Afghan people, because the humanitarian crisis is connected, right, to the political hell that they're living in now under the Taliban. But then, is there any what do you see as an alternative vision of the future for Afghanistan? Is there any effort to organize an Afghan government in exile, to take the legal actions that you might be able to take to gain access to resources and prevent them from going to the Taliban and strengthening the Taliban? So what is the situation that you see today in Afghanistan? What are the implications for U.S. policy? And do you have an alternative vision for the future of the country?
Well, first of all, the argument that the Taliban will change and then there will be legitimacy or recognition of the Taliban. If they were to change, they would have done this in these early days, because now all of the eyes are on the Taliban, and they could gain their political objectives now when they had everything in their control. They didn't do that. So the hope that they will change in the future after giving them enough time to consolidate is perhaps not a realistic one. Second, those who claim that the Taliban crave legitimacy and recognition, absolutely they do. They do want recognition, but we shouldn't forget that they are de facto recognized right now. They were when they were in Doha. Foreign ministers were meeting with them and talking with them, for representatives, and even now their embassies active. The Taliban travel freely, maybe not all over the world, but they travel and they engage with the world. They are not the Taliban of the 1990s, where there was no engagement with the outside world. Today, they have that engagement and they continue negotiations. So, we must be careful about what we say in terms of recognition, because I believe some countries have now already de facto recognized, and maybe for political reasons, they cannot make that announcement. And the other part is the humanitarian relief. Look, while the Taliban is discussion is one-sided, there is true humanitarian catastrophe in Afghanistan right now, and those people deserve to be supported. And we must find creative ways to reach to the most vulnerable Afghans in the country, those displaced, and now by drought and in these recent floods have created even more issues. We also have many Afghans who are displaced internally, but also refugees that are not fully recognized right now. There are people who have been evacuated, and we are thankful for the support that we have received from our allies for doing that. But their situation is not really ideal right now. People are still waiting for their papers to be processed. They're held up in camps and under very difficult circumstances. Some feel as if they're even like prisoners. We can't go out, do anything. They're held in camps, waiting for decisions to be made. So I think there is a multitude of efforts that need to take place. We need to care for the ANDSF soldiers that have been evacuated outside, and do what is necessary to integrate them to societies, to find livelihoods for them, so they're not a burden, and they can actually live respectable lives and earn respectable living. There are those ANDSF soldiers and pro-government forces that are still in Afghanistan who may not qualify for the kind of support that or evacuation that others have benefited from. So we need to reach those, and the plight of those that are being prosecuted needs to be taken very seriously. We have a humanitarian crisis of with children and the most vulnerable population inside Afghanistan that I think we need to reach, and then continue to engage with Afghan leaders to work out a way forward for Afghanistan that could create an inclusive Afghanistan. What I am sure of is that this situation is not going to last very long, because the Taliban are repeating the very same mistakes that the Republic did in the governments before that, in which they monopolized power and didn't care for the causes of the other groups. Afghanistan is a very diverse society, and it needs a diverse government and an approach that could satisfy all of Afghans. So what we need to first of all do, I think, among Afghans is to create a single narrative. The Afghan political class is still very divided, and there is even more divisions now among the diaspora because of what happened. It's very easy to shift blames. But I think it's time we all own the problems that we have and work towards an Afghan solution that would be supported by our partners, people like yourself, but our administrations in the United States and other allies that could then support a cause that would be truly Afghan-owned. And if the Taliban wish to see an Afghanistan in which the Afghan people are happy and can live, and there is broader support, it needs to have a broader set of ideas, not this very narrow-minded government that is currently being enforced.
Master Mohib, I can't thank you enough on behalf of the Hoover Institution. Thank you so much for helping us learn about a continuing battle in Afghanistan, right? Wars don't end when one party disengages. And sadly, I think the war in Afghanistan has just entered a new, even more dangerous and costly phase. But thanks for helping us learn about the situation in Afghanistan. the how and why of the collapse there, and a country that remains important to building a future of peace and prosperity for generations to come. It was good to see you.
Thank you, General McMaster, for this opportunity. I think it's the tip of the iceberg. There is this discussion will continue to last for many years to come on what happened and how to go forward. But thank you for doing your part in beginning that discourse. I'm glad I was able to speak with you today.
Battlegrounds is a production of the Hoover Institution, where we advance ideas that define a free society. For more information about our work, to hear more of our podcasts, or view our video content, please visit hoover.org.